our series on worship and what is worship and why is it significant. And last week, hopefully really got a sense that worship helps create an opportunity for us to be honest with God, but also to turn our focus off of the circumstances around us and focus our attention on who God is, that we might truly encounter his manifest presence in our lives. This morning, we're going to look at a couple other nuances of worship. And next week, we're going to look specifically at music and why God has chosen that music be such a key part of the worship life of a believer. But this morning, we're in Psalm 96, verses 1 through 9. The words that we opened our service with, where it says, "Oh, sing to the Lord a new song. Sing to the Lord all the earth. Sing to the Lord, bless his name. Tell of his salvation from day to day. Declare his glory among the nations, his marvelous works among all the peoples. For great is the Lord, and greatly to be praised. He is to be feared above all gods. For all the gods of the peoples are worthless idols, but the Lord made the heavens. Splendor and majesty are before him. Strength and beauty are in his sanctuary. Ascribe to the Lord, O families of the peoples. Ascribe to the Lord glory and strength. Ascribe to the Lord the glory due his name. Bring an offering and come into his courts. Worship the Lord in the splendor of holiness. Tremble before him, all the earth." The first thing I want us to notice, and we're not necessarily going to go kind of section by section or verse by verse, but there's a couple different things that are really scattered throughout all of these 9 verses. And the first thing that I want us to pay special attention to are the declarations that we see in this passage. The declarations. In verse 2, it tells us to bless his name. It starts with sing to the Lord, bless his name. Verse 2, tell of his salvation. Verse 3, declare his glory. Verse 7, ascribe to the Lord glory and strength. Verse 8, ascribe to the Lord the glory due his name. Verse 9, worship the Lord. So all of these declarations that we are called, all of these things that we are called to affirm and to give to God. Notice how it starts with sing to the Lord a new song. And I love that admonition. And obviously, as someone who loves music, I love that. But it's this reminder to always find new expressions of worshiping God, to not allow ourselves to just fall into a rut of almost having our worship be so similar day after day, week after week, that it starts to lose its significance. I remember years ago when the song Shout to the Lord first came out and loved singing that, but over the years it gets so familiar that it kind of loses its impact. And there's some songs that really impact us when we first hear them and sing them, but over time they don't mean as much. And there's always this call to keep finding new ways to express worship to God. And that's part of the reason I love going to conferences or watching other church services online, is finding those worship songs that I've never heard before. And in those moments, because it really makes you think about the words, because you're not familiar with the melody. And so the words really stand out in new ways, and it opens up these new ways to express worship to God. But if you'll notice, all of these, they are declarations. That God is calling us not just to think great thoughts about him, but to audibly declare, verbally declare these different attributes of God, to verbally declare our worship, to verbally declare who God is. So one way that we can do this, obviously, through singing, but also to go through the names of God. And if you remember a little while back when Dick LaFountain was here with us and talked about the names of God and had a couple books about praying through the names of God, and just sometimes you can say, well, how am I supposed to, what does worship look like? And how do I pray and worship at the same time? And just start going through the names of God. Go through the names of God that you just remember offhand. Alpha and the Omega, beginning and the end. And rather than just recite those, just stop and reflect upon those. And really allow the impact and the weight of those names and attributes of God. As you think about his attributes, we're going to get into that in a second, but I know that God's loving. I know that God's holy. I know that God is powerful. To really take the time to sit with that. And what does that mean? and allow that to spark an increase in your worship. If you pay attention to some of the Apostle Paul's letters in the New Testament, there are times when he's trying to unpack some really profound theological truth, and suddenly he just breaks out into praise the Lord, who's worthy of, he'll just break out into this doxology of praise, because having so saturated his mind and reflected and chewed on these truths about God, he finds himself just overflowing with praise. And if you remember when Jesus taught us to pray, he said, pray this way: Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be your name. That's how Jesus says we should start our praying. Start it with worship, declaring the name of God, the names of God, who God is. This is all a part of worship. Worship isn't just about music, but there is an aspect of worship where God calls us to verbally speak forth these things. Not just to hide them internally, but to actually declare them, to speak them out loud, to go through his names, to go through his attributes, to really take time and think about what those are. And I think about my own prayer life and how often it's tempting to, in prayer, just launch right into all the needs and all the requests that we have, but just kind of blow past how Jesus himself said we should start. He said, start with worship. Start with declaring that his name is holy, that he is your Father in heaven. And with that, as we connect that to worship, there's a lot of debates about which ones are better, hymns or choruses, and there's a lot of opinions, and we'll touch on that next week. But for me, one of the things that is important, where we have all of these: bless his name, tell of his salvation, declare his glory, ascribe to the Lord, worship the Lord. A lot of songs say a lot of great things about God. There are a lot of hymns that were written, especially in a time when people couldn't read or people weren't given the opportunity to have an education. And so theology was put to music to help teach people things about God. And those are great. We don't want to discount those. But for me, there's something special about the songs that are sung directly to God, where you have, you are in them. Songs where I'm speaking directly to God. I mean, as you think about a marriage, it's one thing to go around telling your friends, yeah, my spouse does this and my spouse does that and my spouse does this and it's really great. That's great. You should do that. But there also comes those times where you want to say things directly to your spouse, to affirm your love directly to your spouse. To make sure that our worship isn't simply songs of praise about God or what he's done for me, but telling him directly, this is who you are. This is why you are amazing. This is why I love you. The importance of verbally declaring, verbally speaking forth. There's a certain connection that is made in our minds when we go from simply thinking something to actually saying it out loud. And so to not allow our worship to just be something that we hide in our hearts, but something that we audibly declare with our lips. But then with that, the second thing that we see woven throughout this passage are the attributes. The attributes of God that we are to take notice of. Verse 3, his glory. Again in verse 3, his marvelous works. Verse 4, his greatness. Verse 6, his splendor and his majesty. Verse 6, his strength and his beauty. Verse 7, his glory and strength. To take note of who God is and what God has done. I remember one time, don't mind my purple water, being shown a water bottle and being asked, describe this water bottle. Just write down, what do you notice about this water bottle? Just what details do you notice about this water bottle? And of course, instinctively, you maybe come up with 5 to 10 things. How descriptive can you get about a water bottle? But then if you really pay attention, there's actually a lot. This simple water bottle, there's probably hundreds of things you could note about this water bottle. You just have to look at it long enough to notice. Do you ever find yourself looking at something, maybe a work of art, or maybe you've been to the Grand Canyon or Niagara Falls, and you just stare and observe and take note. Just take it all in. How often do we do that with God, just to come before God and just notice who God is? And allow space in our hearts just to take note of his attributes, of his glory. And just go through description by description by description of who God is. So, well, that sounds kind of hard. Yeah, but it's amazing. To actually take the time to reflect upon the beauty of God. Now, if you go to a book like Song of Solomon, which people have been debating ever since it was written, is this a book about a man and a woman? Is this a book about God and his people? It's probably both. One thing you'll notice in Solomon, sometimes in details that make you blush, is these two people in love take note of the details of each other. That's why you get the guy saying to the woman, "You have the neck like a Tower of Babel," which doesn't seem like a great compliment. I'm sure if we truly understood the historical setting, that would be quite the compliment, but I don't think it translates. They're studying each other and noticing the beauty of each other. Do we stop and just study God? Not just as an intellectual exercise, but just to behold his greatness, his wonder, his power, his love. This is all a part of what it means to worship him, to take the time to notice him, to verbally declare these attributes of his. But the third thing that comes out, which is interesting, is the actions. Now, there's only one action, physical action here in this passage, and that's in verse 9, where it says, "Tremble before him, all the earth." Tremble before him, all the earth. But if you look through the Psalms, there's a lot of times where some physical expression is connected to the act of worship. In my Bible, it probably looks weird, but I take a blue pen and just draw a little stick figure next to all these references, where there's some physical expression of worship, other than singing or speaking or shouting, but some physical action that's associated with worship. And notice some of the descriptions that we get in some of the Psalms. Psalm 5, verse 7. Talks about bowing down before the Lord. I don't know how often we do that. We've kind of lost the cultural significance of bowing before a king or bowing before one that you worship. But this was a physical action that the worshipers of God would undertake, to not simply declare praises of God, but actually to physically get down on the ground. And I feel like I've maybe joined that club where I can now say it's getting up and down isn't always the easiest thing. And I understand there's physical issues that are involved in that, but for the able-bodied, they would actually express what's happening internally in their worship by physically getting down and bowing before the Lord. Psalm 47, verse 1 talks about clapping your hands to the Lord. Well, that seems charismatic. Notice how if you'll notice, we've kind of taken cultural norms and made those the definitive way to worship. Here in the Psalms, we've got bowing, we've got clapping. Clapping is a perfectly acceptable way to worship. And sometimes today, unless you're in a charismatic church, it's like, golf clap, maybe Nobody know this, but it's a biblical way of expressing worship to the Lord. Now, think about for a moment, you're at a Steelers game, and Kenny Pickett leads the team down for a game-winning touchdown with seconds left in the game. And the entirety of Acrisure Stadium sits back and says, "Well done, yet, lad, well done." Kind of weird. What happens? The place goes ballistic. Clapping, to say the least. There's physical expression of what's being felt on the inside. And the same is true here with clapping. Psalm 88, verse 9, talks about spreading out your hands to the Lord. Spreading out your hands, just opening yourself fully, physically, just as you are opening yourself fully from your heart and soul to the Lord. Psalm 95, verse 6 talks about kneeling before the Lord. To humble yourself and actually physically kneel down before the Lord. Psalm 99, just as in our psalm this morning, talks about trembling before Him. Psalm 134, verse 2, as you get more, when you kind of do this, you can kind of like hide because most people won't see you spreading out the hands, but now we're actually lifting the hands up in worship to the Lord. And there's a lot of speculation as to how these different actions are expressing what's happening internally, but just looking at these examples, Psalm 149, verse 3, dancing. People actually dancing as an expression of their worship to the Lord. These are just some of the physical activities, all of which you could worship without doing any of these things. But yet here in the Psalms, that this was the people of Israel, this was their prayer book, this was their worship manual. And we have all of these directives, and in all of these, it's not saying, if you feel like it, if you're comfortable with it, if it's your personality to do it, it's just do these things to the Lord. Be physically expressive in your worship. Again, I'm more of a soccer guy at heart, and I think about the times that Aaron and I go to soccer matches in Columbus, and when our team scores, and you shout and scream until your voice is gone. You hold your team scarf in the air, and there are smoke bombs going off, and through the entire match, and this is part of why I love soccer, from opening kickoff to the final whistle is nonstop singing and chanting. Just little songs of encouraging your team or cheering the team on. It's this full process of engaging in what's happening. And for as kind of reserved and as quiet as I tend to be, I think about if I'm willing to just be a little unhinged for a soccer match, then certainly God is much more significant and much more important than that. Am I willing to allow what's happening in my soul, in my heart in worship, am I allowing that to actually begin to manifest in how I'm carrying myself, what I'm doing physically? Researchers say that physical expressions bridge the gap between our conscious and unconscious mind. It's making that connection between what's actively going on and what's deep down as we begin to allow ourselves to physically express what's going on the inside. And as you look through that list, I would simply offer you one invitation. To maybe get alone with God and say, you know what, Lord, I want to give you all that I am. And I want to experience everything that I can experience in my relationship to you. I've never lifted my hands in worship, Lord. And so, Lord, I'm just going to take one day, one Sunday, whatever it is, and Lord, I'm just going to try it and see if there's something in this that you want for me. And see if maybe you want to just use this as a way to take my worship deeper than it's gone before. And so, Lord, I'm just going to, as an experiment, say, okay, the Psalms say to do this, so I'm just going to try it. Lord, I've never clapped my hands in worship, but since the Psalms invite us to do it, and could technically say they command us to do it, I'm going to just give it a try and see what happens. It doesn't mean you have to forever do this. But maybe say, Lord, you know what? I'm just going to give you an opportunity. Is there something here you want for me? And maybe, if you're feeling risky, when your spouse or significant other or someone who is in your house with you, maybe when they're out of the house for a little bit or outside doing something, you turn on the radio or the CD player and maybe you dance a little to worship. So that nobody sees it, but just whatever moves you got, just, Lord, I'm just going to lift this up and just see. To give yourself to freedom to say, Lord, these are ways in which your people have worshiped you, have expressed their love for you, and I just want to see if maybe there's something here that you have for me. Because maybe always just going by what feels right to me, maybe there's something more that you're inviting me to. And that brings me to just kind of a sub-action in verse 8, where it says, bring an offering. Bring an offering to the Lord. Now, in the Old Covenant, there were prescribed offerings to bring to God. We don't have to bring an animal sacrifice to God in the New Covenant. But if you'll notice, all of those riveting, exciting chapters of the Old Testament that talk about the specifications of the offerings, page turners. What kind of animal you're to bring for what kind of sacrifice and what are the stipulations and how is this to be done. You'll notice something very interesting about the offerings that God prescribes be brought to him. He sets the terms. He sets the terms. God doesn't leave this open-ended, bring whatever you want. In fact, that's what happens specifically when you get to the book of Malachi. The people were just bringing what they wanted rather than what God asked for. And so, of course, they're not bringing their best lambs because they want to keep those for themselves. They're bringing that runt of the litter, the kind of deformed one, the pitiful one that they just want to get rid of. Just give that to God. And God is very explicit in Malachi to say, if this is your approach to worship, close the doors and stop. I don't want it. Throughout the Old Covenant, God says, this is the offering that I want. This is the way that I want to be worshiped. This is the way that I want you to approach me. And we become a very individualistic, and it's become what makes me feel good, what I'm comfortable with, what I want to do. And I'm not saying that God doesn't meet us with how he's created us, but there's also this missing element of, Lord, how do you want me to worship you? Instead of, Lord, how do I want to worship you? How is it that you want me to worship you? Because if left to my own devices, I'm going to stay with how I'm comfortable. But sometimes God is calling us to go beyond what is natural or comfortable into all that he has for us. And that might mean, you know what, Lord, I'm going to try doing one of these expressions that I've never done before. And I'm comfortable with it, and I'm scared, and I'm nervous. Because if you'll notice, what so often holds us back, bowing down. Well, I don't want to be the only one. Clapping. Lord, I don't clap on the right beat. Spread out hands, Lord, I don't want people to think I've gone overboard, charismatic. Certainly not going to dance. Even singing loudly, what holds us back? I don't sing very well, and I don't want other. You notice where the focus is? The focus is, how are others going to perceive me? Rather than, Lord, how do you want me to come to you? I want to invite us to allow the Lord to speak to our hearts, to maybe open up a new door of worship, a new expression of worship that we've never tried before. To say, Lord, maybe I've been missing out on something. Maybe I've been missing out on just an experience of your presence because I've been too afraid to try this thing. And again, I'm not trying to say just make up whatever you want and go for it. These are things that Scripture actually says are done in worship. I'm not saying, grab the biggest helium balloon you can find, just suck it all up, and then just let your worship rip. I mean, it's probably not the healthiest thing to do, and nobody does that in the Bible, but these are actually biblical expressions of worship. To say, Lord, is there something in one or more of these that you're inviting me to? Maybe, if the actions are too much, maybe it's back to the declarations. Maybe it's back to sing to the Lord a new song, to say, Lord, I want to find a new favorite worship song. I want to find a new song that kind of becomes the song that just so connects me with your presence. How might God be calling you to something deeper in your worship of Him? Calling you to maybe be more expressive, to open up more of who you are, to more of who God is. And we'll touch on that more next week. But for now, let's pray.